Okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about social learning and cognition. Social cognition, when we talk about social cognition, we're talking about learning. Learning is probably best thought of as the relatively permanent change in knowledge that is the result of experience, right? So when we think about learning, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? A permanent change or a relatively permanent change in knowledge based on or acquired through experience. We're going to look at some of the processes through which learning occurs. I'll have a couple of things to say about social cognition overall and what it allows us to do. And then I want to talk about some of the concepts that are connected to or related to that. So some of them are processes that allow social cognition to occur. Some of them are errors and tendencies to do social cognition in a way that's problematic or that leads to the formation of flawed understandings of the world around us. All right, so let's start with the different sources of social knowledge. When we think about learning and where it comes from, generally speaking, there are three categories of social, or three sources of social knowledge. The first is what we call operant learning. Then there is associative learning, and then there is observational learning. So operant learning is a learning principle in which a response increases in frequency as a result of it being followed by reinforcement. Now, this sounds probably to some of you with a psych background like behaviorism. It is behaviorism. Basically, the idea is that experiences that are followed by rewards are likely to be repeated, whereas experiences that are followed by punishments are likely to not be repeated. And here, most of the time when we think of rewards and punishments, we're talking about positive and negative emotions, respectively. So essentially, the summary of this concept of operant learning is that people learn from the consequences of their actions. Um, Associative learning is a little bit different. Associative learning is a principle that says ideas and experiences reinforce each other. So the things that we think and the things that we experience reinforce each other and can be mentally linked to each other. So positive associations and negative associations that are linked to an object will shape how we internalize it. Essentially, people learn based on the associations that are linked to those objects. So, for example, advertising that that encourages us to generate a fear response to a particular product or a particular set of experiences will lead us to sort of try to avoid that product or those experiences. This really works when what we know about an object or an experience is limited, right? It seems like, if we're being told to if we're being encouraged to form positive associations with things that we know to be negative or vice versa, that knowledge, that pre-existing knowledge, can impact the degree to which associative learning works. But in a vacuum, or in a relative vacuum where the amount of information we have about something is limited, so something that's new or unfamiliar, the associations that are created from external sources about the relationship between that object and how we should feel about it tend to lead to the formation of particular understandings of the meaning or the significance of those objects or experiences. And then finally, observational learning is kind of exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a learning principle that says we learn by observing and modeling another individual's behaviors, their attitudes, their emotional expressions. So social influences and inputs here become very, very useful sources of learning, even in the absence of direct experience, right? So we don't have to necessarily directly be experiencing something to be learning about it, because we're able to observe it, sometimes via media, sometimes via watching people interact in a particular social location or context. But essentially here in this particular kind of learning, people are learning by observing the behavior of others. So cognition, social cognition is essentially when we sort and organize data by naming those things or applying social categories to those things. So remember in the previous video we talked about categorization and conceptualization, right? So that's part of this social cognition process. So we sort and organize data by naming it, by giving it a meaningful label, and organizing it into categories, right? So conceptualization and categorization, and that is ultimately what gives those data their particular meaning. So one of the things that social cognition does is it allows us to form impressions of others, right? This is really, really important because having a particular impression of others will allow us to determine how to act toward them. It will allow us to anticipate how they may act toward us. It's something that makes role-taking possible. We're going to talk a lot about role-taking in the coming weeks. And one of the things, which is a little bit of a spoiler, role-taking involves putting yourself in the position of another person and looking at things from that person's perspective. Now, you're not this other person, but you know enough about the role and status that they occupy. Maybe you have some firsthand biographical information. If it's somebody who's close to you and you've spent a lot of time with, you have a tremendous amount of knowledge about them, their expectations, their way of looking at and understanding things. And in a sense, you can put yourself, or at least a portion of yourself, in their perspective, in their position, and examine things from their point of view. And one of the things that you are going to examine from their point of view is yourself, is you. When we are forming impressions of others, it isn't just that we're starting to understand them per se, right? We're not just understanding them as them, we're also understanding them because we are going to use them as a social resource to understand ourselves. And I know that doesn't necessarily make sense right now. Maybe it does, but even if it doesn't, don't worry, because this is where we're going to be going next. But understand that social cognition is an essential element in developing a sense of ourself, because the perspective of others and the expectations of others are a critical element of that. So to the extent that social cognition allows us to understand others, that's going to be really, really important. Now, one of the things I'd like to point out here is that this process relies a lot on the use of things like stereotypes. And I know that, the cultural shorthand is that stereotyping is bad. We shouldn't stereotype. And generally speaking, I think the way that people use those terms when they're making those points, they're making a very valid assertion, which is that we shouldn't rely solely on stereotypes to understand other people. But I would like to just make a brief case for stereotypes, because when you don't know anything else about other people, knowing something about the categories that they occupy and the expectations of people in those categories becomes really, really important as a resource to sort of kickstart those initial interactions. It's a concept that Lynn Laughlin calls categoric knowing. So we talk to women differently than men, we talk to old people differently than younger people, and we talk to young people differently than we talk to children, right? So various kinds of social rules about how we conduct ourselves in interactions are built around the statuses of these social others. And when you first meet a person, all you really have are those crude stereotypes of, woman, old person, man, young person, boy, girl, child, right? So we start there, and then as we acquire additional information, as we bring in more information through that, the context of through the experience of that interaction, we're able to form a much more nuanced picture of the social other that we're interacting with. But you can see the value of stereotypes as an initial starting point. You can even imagine, although I try to avoid doing too much evolutionary psychology, because it turns out I think a lot of it is empirically kind of shaky. But you could imagine a scenario, conceptually anyway, it makes sense, that people, or early humans who were able to differentiate between predator and prey, because they were relatively easy, or relatively capable of sorting things rapidly into categories, were much more able to survive than people who took longer to sort of generate an understanding of the things that they were observing in the world around them. So you can see a kind of mental cognitive sort of shortcut that stereotyping can actually provide you some pretty valuable social resources, even as it potentially comes with a cost. So just kind of keep in mind when we talk about social cognition, we're going to look at this sort of the entirety of this process through which we sort data and organize data in a way that renders it meaningful. And the two primary conceptual things, call these concepts. The concepts that we're going to use to understand this are schema and frames. So let's start with schema. Schema are a set of beliefs, and the plural is schemas, by the way, if you're wondering. So schema, singular, schema is plural. Schema are a set of beliefs or preconceptions that organize the information we gather about a specific object, person, or concept. Broadly, social cognition and learning lead to the formation of knowledge. That knowledge is stored in schemas. So schemas serve as an expectation for future events, essentially by functioning as templates into which information gets sorted, which in turn allows us to understand that information. So we have these, they're cognitive structures, they're learned, right? They come from socialization, but there's structures that exist in our mind that help us to sort of categorize and conceptualize that information that we're bringing in through our senses. Understand a couple of things. First, schemas are unconscious, right? That means we don't consciously use them. They're built in, and they become we become habituated to them. So they're unconscious. The other thing is that they kind of develop through two interesting processes. All right, so we learn them through socialization, but then they change. They can be modified. They can be utilized in ways that suggest that they're not fixed and permanent, but rather they can grow and adapt as we acquire information. So the two processes through which schema develop, right, once they've been established, the way that they further develop is through two processes, one of which is called accommodation, the other is assimilation. Accommodation is when we change a schema as a result of new information, right? So we have a cognitive structure that exists in our minds. We are bringing in information that seems to be at odds with our pre-existing schema, so we alter the schema. And I think that's probably the thing that we ought to do as we get additional information. We ought to be willing to change our mental models accordingly. What we actually tend to do is we engage in assimilation. And assimilation is where we actually change the conflicting information to fit into an existing schema. It's easier, so maybe that's defensible on that level, but the problem is that this inclination toward assimilation underlies what we call the confirmation bias, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But I just want to say that while both of these things, accommodation and assimilation, are things that we can do with information, we tend to do the latter. We tend, once we have a conceptual structure established in our minds, we tend to rely pretty heavily on the structure to the point where we end up fitting information to it rather than adapting it to reflect new information. All right, so putting schema aside for a moment, I wanted to say something about frames. Frames are, you can think of these as schema of interpretation. And I'll get into the details of what all that means in a moment. But basically what frames allow us to do is perceive, identify, and label events and occurrences. So not a specific object, not a specific person, not a specific concept, but events, occurrences, right? Larger, kind of contextual. So frames, what frames do is they essentially render meaning, they organize experience, and they guide our actions. They are also unconscious. They are more complex than schema. If it helps, you could think of frames as networks of contextually grounded schemas. I know that probably doesn't make much sense, but think of a classroom, right? A classroom is a frame in which your existing schemas of teachers and students allow you to kind of understand not just those people, oh, that's the teacher, that's the student, but to also understand the kind of interactions that are going to unfold in the context of that interaction, the kind of expectations that are impinging on and constraining the actions and the operations of these individuals. So frames are kind of schema about context, whereas schema are schema about specific social objects and concepts and people. We tend to only notice frames when they get violated. So if you think about the use of a term like frame, and you think about it in the most everyday vernacular sense, right? You'd think of like a picture or a piece of art. And the frame, the purpose of the frame in a museum or in an art gallery is to get you to focus on the art. You're not supposed to really notice the frame. The frame is just there to kind of focus your attention on what it is you need to be paying attention to, right? It shapes your understanding of the broader context by saying, this stuff inside is art and this other stuff is not. So focus on this. When we go to a modern art museum and we see something kind of unusual, we walk into a room, maybe there's a chair in the corner, and on the floor around the chair there might be a whole bunch of candy wrappers or something, and your immediate reaction is, well, I'm in a museum and I don't see anything else. Is that supposed to be the art? Right? You have an expectation going into the room that you're going to see some art, and you're looking at the walls and there are no pictures in frames. But there is this stuff in the corner, and you're wondering, is that the art? Is it somebody forgot to clean up? The janitor maybe sat there overnight and was eating some Snickers bars or something, and now we've got this mess. And the problem is, there's no frame to tell you that, yes, this is the art. No, this is not the art. And you're left to kind of figure it out for yourself, and it can be kind of exasperating. So that's kind of what frames are doing in the context of our cognition. They're telling us sort of what it is we need to be focusing on. And again, we're not going to notice them unless something violates the frame. So we have, for example, in the United States, a frame of what we call heteronormativity. Means, to be kind of as brief as possible, it means the default assumption for human sexuality is heterosexuality. It doesn't mean everybody understands or accepts or embraces this. It just means the cultural norm, the broad social fact is that in the United States, most people, without even thinking about it, just kind of assume that the default state for human sexuality is heterosexuality. When we're walking down the hall and we see two people at the end of the hall clearly engaged in some kind of argument or fight, we can tell from their facial expressions and their body language. Even if we can't hear them yet, we can say, oh, those two people are having a fight. If it's a man and a woman, we might assume that it's a couple having a fight. When we get up to that dyad, those two people, and we hear the actual things they're saying, it kind of confirms, yep, that's a couple, they're having a fight. If we see in the distance two men or two women having a fight, we might assume that they're having a fight about, something else, right? Not necessarily a couple's disagreement or conflict. And when we get up to them and it turns out that they're having a fight because they are a couple, we might realize, oh, I didn't really expect that. And it's in that moment, if you're thinking about it, that you realize you had an expectation, right? Because the frame has been violated. You realize for just a brief moment that there was a frame in the first place. I don't think most people walk around with that level of introspection or self-awareness, but if they are going to see a frame, that will be the circumstances in which they're most likely to see it when it is in fact violated. Okay. So I said I was going to say some things about confirmation bias. So let's say some things about confirmation bias. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, it's a tendency on the behalf of people to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions, often leading to errors, right? So again, that assimilation process in the operation of our schemas. When we have a pre-existing idea about how things ought to be, and we find information that fits that schema, we embrace it. When we find information that doesn't fit our schema, we either try to alter or distort the information so that it fits, or in some extreme cases where we can't do that, we'll find a way to dismiss that information. We'll treat it as not typical, or we'll just sort of, write it off as not particularly important, in part because it threatens an existing model for how the world works. So that's the kind of the risk that flows from our tendency to engage in assimilation in the development and the operation of our schemas, as opposed to accommodation. Another bias, I think this is a bias, is what we call the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect is really interesting. It's a cognitive bias in which people who have limited knowledge or limited competence in a given intellectual or social domain overestimate their own knowledge or their own competence in that area. In other words, people who think they know a little bit, or who know maybe a little bit about something, think they know a lot about that thing, and as a result of that, they overestimate their competence, they overestimate their knowledge. Essentially, the skills and insight needed to achieve something approaching mastery in a given field leads to an ability to recognize gaps in one's knowledge. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is what happens when people don't have the skills and insights, right? So becoming an expert in a field requires that you spend a lot of time in that field, doing the work, doing the research, doing the reading, right? Doing all of that stuff. And that takes a really long time and involves a significant number of setbacks and overcoming obstacles and wondering if you're ever going to get it, right? And you spend a lot of time in it. And the more time you spend in it, the more competent you get, the greater the level of mastery of the skills and abilities that are specific to that field, but also a recognition of the things that you don't know, because you begin to get a sense of the field as a whole. You see what you know relative to the body of knowledge that makes up the field, and you also recognize what you don't know relative to the body of knowledge that makes up the field, or the skill set that makes up the field. But there are a lot of people who don't know anything about the field. They have a little bit of information, and it leads them to overestimate what they know about the field. A really kind of tongue-in-cheek way to describe the Dunning-Kruger effect is some people are too dumb to recognize that they're dumb. Right? To recognize what you know and you don't know, you really have to have a broad sort of understanding of a field overall. And when that is not the case, I watched a YouTube video and now I know something about this large, complicated field of study. I don't know if you guys, this is a little older series of commercials, but are you a doctor? No, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. It's that kind of dynamic. It's that kind of phenomenon. Back in 1871, Charles Darwin, who, the author of The Descent of Man, wrote in The Descent of Man, he wrote, "Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge." And that's basically his way of saying, that not knowing something, or knowing just a tiny little bit about something can make somebody feel really confident in a way that does not reflect any actual real understanding. Experts and masters of particular fields and disciplines are often pretty circumspect about, or not circumspect. They're fairly candid about acknowledging what they know and what they don't know, and how they got to that particular point. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is something really, really important. I think, especially right now in our particular historical and cultural moment, there are a lot of people out there who, they'll, what do they say? I did my own research. And what that means is I watched 2 YouTube videos produced by people whose ideas and biases and information I'm already kind of on board with, right? So confirmation bias can lead to people, falling into this pattern that's described by the Dunning-Kruger effect. Last cognitive related thing that I want to talk about, and then we can wrap this up, is what we call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a mental conflict that occurs when beliefs or assumptions are contradicted by new information. And this, I think, is part of the reason why people favor assimilation. This is part of the reason why the confirmation bias remains such a lingering problem, is because for a lot of people, the contradiction that arises when new and different information bumps up against an established expectation or belief produces a really, really uncomfortable cognitive state. The primary developer of this theory of cognitive dissonance was a guy named Leon Festinger back in the 1950s and 1940s, who pointed out that people don't like it when existing ideas or existing beliefs that they've held and that are central to, that are important to them, seem to be contradicted by new information or experiences that are at odds with the ideas that exist inside a person's head. We like the idea that information and experiences that we're having are consistent with the information and experiences that we expect to have, right? We want that to be the case. Interestingly enough, when we think about, like in sociology, the one of the places where we see cognitive dissonance pop up a lot is in the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, right? So attitudes point to the existing kind of structures that exist cognitively within your mind, and behaviors are kind of presumed to be the external manifestation of the stuff that's in your mind. And we like our behaviors to be consistent with our internal cognitive states. And most of the time they are. We will, if we are engaging in behavior that's inconsistent with our cognitive state, we'll change our behavior so that it is consonant rather than dissonant. If I am a racist and I don't like people from a particular racial or ethnic group, I would go out of my way to avoid them. And thus, I'm consistent. I don't like these people and I don't spend any time with them. If I can't avoid spending time with them, in other words, if I'm in a desegregated educational environment or a desegregated workplace or a desegregated community, and I have to every day interact with these people as social equals, eventually that cognitive dissonance, the disconnect between what I'm doing over here in terms of my behavior and the idea that exists in my head about the way things ought to be. I can't change this. This has been mandated by law. This is a social phenomenon. So I'll change my attitudes. I'll change my cognitive states. So I'll go through that process of accommodation rather than give in to my tendency to want to engage in assimilation. There are a lot of defensive maneuvers that people will deploy in response to this feeling of cognitive dissonance. Some people will, as I said, they'll reject, or they'll explain away, or they'll even try to avoid new information. People will try to persuade themselves that no conflict really actually exists, that these things that seem to be at odds with one another aren't. They'll come up with some kind of rationalization. Or, as I said, they will eventually alter, they'll accommodate the new information by altering their underlying schemas. So that, I think, kind of gives us a good summary of cognitive processes and social learning, and some of the consequences of the operation of our schema and frames, and our tendency to favor assimilation over accommodation. It is entirely possible that tendency toward assimilation rather than accommodation is a cultural product, right? That we live in a society in the United States that values and rewards certainty and confidence. Those things can certainly lead us to adopt an assimilationist tendency when it comes to how we fit new information into existing schema. I think to really know the answer to that, we would need to engage in some significant cross-cultural research. We don't want to sort of fall into that trap of weird populations like we read about in the Johnson article. But again, you can kind of see these patterns if you look at American society, if you look at American culture, and again in the 21st century, especially the last few years. I think it's really, really obvious that you can see these kind of phenomena kind of playing out. So that should wrap it up for now, and next time we'll talk a little bit about selves. All right. So until then, take care.